Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Humulus U 2022. I continue to be your host, Wayne Check. I'm the Senior Director of Product Strategy here at BSG. For those of you attending today for the first time, Humulus U is BSG's educational hop harvest experience, including not only today's webinar, but an entire month of events, including our in-person symposium taking place on September 22nd. I'm super excited to continue our webinar series this week. If you missed last week's talk on hop sustainability with Carlos Ruiz from HVG, stay tuned as that will be posted on our YouTube channel soon. As a reminder, registration and more info for all of our Humulus U activities can be found at humulusu.com, and all of the content from previous years can be found on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/bsgcraft. Today, I'm incredibly excited to have BSG's own Ashton Lewis here to reintroduce you to T45 Hop Pellets. Following the presentation, there will be a moderated Q&A, so please use the Q&A function in Zoom at the bottom of your window to submit any questions throughout the webinar. Again, super excited to have Ashton Lewis here to speak with us today. Ashton has been with BSG since 2016. He's currently the Manager of Training and Technical Support. He has vast experience in the brewing world, including his time as the staff master brewer and brewing group sales manager for the Paul Mueller Company, and his time as a partner and master brewer with the Springfield Brewing Company. You may also recognize him from his work with Brew Your Own magazine over the last 27 years as technical director and his Help Me Mr. Wizard columnist. So with that, Ashton, welcome, and I will turn it over to you.
Thanks for the awesome intro, Wayne. Welcome to our Humulus U 2022. So the title of my talk today is Reintroducing T45 Hop Pellets, a technology ahead of its time. So I'm getting a little bit older here, so I'm just a little bit older than T45s. They've been around for a while. So today we're going to talk about the pellet hop history, because it's got kind of an interesting history, long history. Go over T90 production and also T45 production from a cone to pellet perspective, talk about some of the advantages of T45 pellets in comparison to T90. And then we're going to do a little bit of sensory with me. So it's kind of virtual sensory, and then a couple takeaway messages. So Wayne's already given my my background, but I've been at BSG for since 2016, December 2016. Before that, I was in the world of stainless steel at Mueller, and I worked on a lot of different brewing projects, food processing projects, etc. And at the same time, I was a Springfield Brewing Company. So those were really the same part of my existence. Before the world of work, my background's in food science. So I've got a BS from Virginia Tech and a master's from Davis. And like Wayne said, I've been part of Brew Your Own magazine. So shameless plug for, hard to believe, 27 years now. So on to the fun stuff here. Pellet hop history. So how did pellets get started? When did they get started, and why were they developed? Well, they started out in the early 1970s is when the pellet hop was invented, and it was really an evolution of low density, hard to handle hop powders. So the first hop product beyond the cone hop that was used for brewing were hop powders, and they basically were just milled hops. So they were certainly easier to move around than bales of whole hops. They were easier to separate. They did have advantages, but one of the key disadvantages is they're dusty. So if you've worked with hop powders before, they're not dense like pellets. They're powdery, and they can kind of fly around. The other real disadvantages to powders is that they have a huge surface area, and that's opens them up for oxidation and deterioration during storage. So the hop pellet was really developed to overcome some of those disadvantages, and that was done in the early 1970s. The first pellets were known as type or T90, so we call those type 90 or T90 pellets, and the name is related to how much raw hop weight compared to the finished pellet weight you have. So in a T90 pellet, the finished weight is about 90% of the raw hop weight that comes into the processing facility. And you might be wondering, well, what happens to that 10%? Well, there's some parts of the hops that are separated and cleaned, like strigs and stems and so forth. And in the old days, the hops actually had a drying step in the hop processing facility to remove some moisture. But the name stuck, even though today a T90 pellet is really more like a T95. So the modern hop pellet that we call a T90 has about 95% of the raw hop weight. And the main difference there is that the off-kiln moistures at the hop farm in the 70s were a little bit higher than they are today. This is lower in the 70s. That's actually backwards. But the today we have about a T95. So what is the T90 pellet? Well, it's essentially the same composition as a hop cone. Really, there's no change in the composition of the hop, but they're a higher density. So the density is about 2.7 times that of a bale hop, which is a real advantages for handling, shipping, storage. Just the overall user friendliness of the pellet is a much easier product to use than whole bale hops. The other real advantage of the pelletized hops is the way they're packaged. So the modern pellet is packaged in some type of film package, usually a Mylar type package that has excellent oxygen barrier properties. And the modern pellets are packaged typically in some type of modified inert gas packaging. So either a nitrogen, carbon dioxide, or a blend of the two gases is common. Now, not long ago, we used to buy hops that were in a vacuum pack, and there are some hops that are still vacuum packed on the market, but that's not a very common method anymore. One of the real downsides of vacuum packing is that there are some sharp things in hops, like stems as an example, or even hard pellets can be kind of sharp. And if a vacuum pack is purest, it's under a vacuum, so it actually will suck air in from the environment and accelerate oxidation, because it actively, the package will actively pull in moisture or oxygen into the package. The modern packages that we use today, the modified atmosphere packages, are kind of like pillows, and they're much more stable. So if you're a home brewer or small brewer that repacks hops, just remember that vacuum packing, it works well, but it can have some downsides to it. So just a real quick overview of T90 production. We're not here to talk about T90. We're going to be focusing on T45, but whether we're making T90 pellets or T45, they start out the same. And the basic steps, we start in the field, and that's what we've just started doing in North America, is harvesting hops from the field. So if you go out to Yakima or Willamette Valley of Oregon or parts of Idaho right now, you're going to see a lot of hop harvesting going on. So we bring the hop plants into the picking shed, remove the cones and leaves from the bines, and then separate the cones. Then we go into kilning. There's an adjustment period after kilning. That's what these large piles of hops are in the lower center of this picture here. And then finally, the kiln hops are then baled. And that's the basic storage of any type of hop really in the world, is the bale. Now, some hops are pelletized immediately after kilning, but a lot of hops are first baled and then pelletized later on. So the main steps of the process, again, these steps are really similar to T45. We start out with a drying step, which probably doesn't happen in most processing facilities today, certainly not at BSG or other facilities that I'm aware of in North America. We don't have the step. And in the older days, when hops may have come in to a hop processing facility with a little bit higher moisture content, there could be a secondary drying, and that's what this is showing. Following that step, which in most plants today, you would go into a bale breaker, and after the bale breaker, the hops are sent into a mill, usually a hammer mill. So the hops are turned into a powder. Immediately after the pellet mill, or I'm sorry, the hammer mill, they go into a standardization tank. This tank here in this diagram, this is from HVG, is the source of this information. But they have vertical tanks in their facilities. The plant, the BSG plant, we have a horizontal blending tank. But whether it's a vertical or horizontal tank, the idea here is that the hop powder is homogenized because there's multiple bales that go in to a production run. And then that powder is then sent to the pellet die. And then immediately after the pellet die, we go into a cooler. So some of the heat that's generated during forming, which is really not that much, we cool our pellet dye with liquid nitrogen. It's controlled to a temperature, but any excess heat that comes out of the dye is then removed in a cooling system, and then we basically go immediately to packaging. So that's kind of an overview of how most T90 pellets are made. Here's some action shots here. The upper left-hand corner here, you can see a lot of bales that are stored. So during harvest, which like I've said many times is occurring now, these bales come in from farms. Very, very few hop farms in the US have any type of processing facility on site. So from the farm, the bales are sent to processing facilities, stored cold, and then when ready to process, the bales are then taken through a bale breaker step, through a hammer mill, through the standardization tank, and then they're pelletized, packaged into a modified atmosphere type package. That's what we show here in the bottom center. At BSG, we use nitrogen in our packaging, and we measure each package individually for the oxygen content of the package. And we reject, our filling machine actually goes into an alarm stage and does not steam if the oxygen atmosphere in that package is too high, which rarely occurs, but we do have a control step on that. And then the hops are then packaged in the boxes and then stored cold. So that's the T90 process. So let's transition into T45. Interestingly enough, the T45 was developed very, very shortly after the T90. So the T90 was developed in the early 70s, and so was the T45. So they were introduced at about the same time. And the T45 pellet was so named because about 45% of the raw hop weight, which is about 2 times what a T90 is retained in the finished pellet. The term T45 is a little bit of a misnomer, just like T90. I said earlier that today a T90 is often more like a T95. In practice, the T45 is usually not a T45. It's something within a range, and the range is about 35 to 60% of the raw hop weight is what we find in what we call the T45. Now, if we look back in history and say, well, why were these pellets first invented? One of the main drivers of this happens to be the type of hops that are grown in Germany, where the pellet hops were developed. So the noble varieties that are grown in Germany tend to be fairly low alpha. So somewhere in probably the 3 to 7% alpha range is typical for a lot of noble hops. There's some noble hops, like if you look at the alphas on Saaz hops from the Czech Republic, Saaz are sometimes as low as 2% alpha, but typically 3 to 7%. So the T45 was used to enrich the alpha fraction to really make the hop easier to ship and to store, just to reduce some of that bulk. And by enriching the lupulin fraction, which is what this whole process is about, you enrich the oils that come from the lupulin gland as well. So that's kind of why T45s were developed. And one of the reasons why there's a range of concentration from 35 to 60% is that depending on the alpha, you can have more or less concentration. So for some higher alpha varieties, it's not practical to concentrate too much, because if there's too much alpha, the powder is actually difficult to turn into a pellet. So there is a range that's typically seen out there. And the same basic technology can be used to standardize the pellet alpha, because there's going to be some blending of plant material back with the lupulin gland, which you'll see the process flowing in a second. So the T45 production can either be kind of a range, or it can be standardized. So you can say, well, I want to target about a 2x concentration, or you could say, well, I want to turn a 4% alpha hop into a 10% enriched pellet, and you can actually control that to have a standardized finished product. So how are T45s made? Well, the flow diagram looks similar if you just kind of glance at it, but there's some key differences. So again, the hops are dried, typically either at completely on the farm, or some touch-up drying in the processing plant. But the next step is a key difference. The first thing that happens is that the hop is made very, very cold, and its temperature is reduced to about minus 35 degrees Celsius. And this is before particle size reduction occurs. So when the hop gets that cold, what happens is the lupulin gland, which contains resins and oils, becomes fairly hard. And that the rigidity of the lupulin gland makes it more stable. It doesn't get damaged as easily when it's processed. The other key difference is that the lupulin gland becomes something that can be fairly easily separated from the hop grist that's formed when the hops are milled. So first, reduce temperature to minus 35 degrees Celsius. Then milling takes place under cold temperatures. So you can see in this diagram, this little blue wiggly stuff, that's cold airflow. So we have cold milling, and then the third step of the process here, and the part of the slide we're looking at right now, is to concentrate the lupulin. So there's a series of screens that are used, and the shaker screens separate the lupulin gland from the cellulosic material that's part of the hop. And you can see at the bottom of this diagram, there's two streams that flow out. There's the lupulin-rich fraction, and then there's the fraction that mainly contains hop parts that don't have lupulin. So the lupulin, when it's really, really cold, will separate from the bracts and the strigs, and you can have these two fractions. Now there is sometimes blending, usually, well, almost always blending a part of this fraction back into the lupulin powder so that can be pelletized. So you can see that there's some of the hop cellulose material blended with the lupulin glands. Those go into a standardization tank, a mixing tank, just like regular pellets, T90 pellets. So we have mix and standardize, and then we go into pelletize. Again, depending on the pellet system that's used, some pellet dyes are cooled, others not so much, and there might be some heat generated during the compression process of turning that powder into a pellet. The excess heat, if there is any excess heat, is removed. And then finally, the T45 pellet is then packaged. So very, very similar process with a few key differences between the T45 and the T90. Here's some data, and this is real data, but it just kind of shows a story here where you can see the leaf alpha. So the first data point here, this is Humulus is the variety. So this is 8.1% alpha coming out of the field. That's dry, dried hop alpha. The pellet alpha is 17.5%. This is an enriched pellet. So there's two different numbers we can calculate. If we take 17.5 times 100, made a mistake in my formula there, and divide it by 8.1. Actually, I modified this formula, it dropped out. I'm sorry about that. That'll give us the enrichment factor. So in this case, the Humulus is 2.16 times more concentrated in alpha than the raw hop coming in. And then if we take the inverse of that and multiply that by 100, we get 46 is the type. So you can see that in general, we're around that 45. So you have 46, type 49 for Mandarina, Bavaria. This is, again, these numbers can be changed, but these are just examples. 48, type 57. So this is a lower level of concentration. In this case, we're looking at Cashmere, type 51 for Eldo, type 45 for Triumph, and 53 for Comet. I do know why these numbers are a little bit high. These were some test runs that were produced, and with shorter runs, it's a little bit harder to control the alpha because there's less product to blend. But that's just an example of how these numbers might look. So when you buy T45 or products that are essentially the same technology with trade names that are being applied to them, you'll notice that on the package shows the concentrated alpha. And processors will calculate these values, and then you can, if you want to, you can determine what the type is just by comparing the package alpha to the leaf alpha, which you may not know, but you can estimate that. Okay, so let's get out of the rabbit hole on that. What are the pros of T45? Well, there's actually a lot of pros, and I cannot think of a single con. So they're higher density. So what does that mean? Well, the higher density, because there's less plant material, there's a higher density of alpha. They have a lower shipping cost per weight of the stuff we want in our beer, alpha and oil. There's also a less volume to store because they're more dense. They're more, enriched with lupulin and oil. Hop addition volume is reduced. That might not make a big deal on a small brewery, but if you're a large brewery and you're using a lot of hop material, that's actually maybe a physical thing where people are adding hop products, or it could be a limitation of equipment, especially if you're using very high hopping rates with brew houses that might not be designed for 2, 3, 4 pound per barrel hop additions. If you have like an automated hop dosing system, the T45 could be an advantage over a T90 if you're making really hoppy beer. And then perhaps the most important thing that kind of sums all this stuff up is improved sustainability. So really the T45, because of its higher density and all of these factors, it is a more sustainable hop product in comparison to the T90. Now, as a brewer, I think the most compelling argument in favor of T45 is really the sensory effects. And I'm a pretty picky beer drinker. I think I've got a halfway decent palate. And I personally do not like grassy or astringent characters in my beer. And I really don't care what the style is. I do like really hoppy beer. I like bitter beer, but I don't like beers that leave my palate just coated with, polyphenols. And I don't like the grassy character that some beers have. And the reason that grassy character and the astringency oftentimes accompanies high and bitterness is because of the high amount of plant matter that we have in those products. So reduced grassy and astringent characters, smoother beer flavor. And I'm not talking about crushability here. I'm just talking about, kind of a smooth palate, nice balance. Even in, really, really hoppy beers, the reduction in that plant material really does just smooth out the beer. I was talking to a friend and coworker this week about some beers that I've been kind of playing with, meaning drinking more regularly. And one beer that I've been really enjoying is Corona La Familiar. And I live in Missouri, and we have that beer available here. And I find that the La Familiar has a real assertive bitterness. And I don't mean like high IBU, but it's got a real sharp hop bitterness that cleans up really quickly. And I don't know for certain what kind of hops they use in that beer, but I'm guessing that they use some kind of hop extract that's just really very, very low with polyphenol. Now, finally, we talk about density, sensory effects. Now let's talk about loss. And loss is another thing that to me is very, very compelling. I think all these are compelling, but the effect on losses is very, very real, especially when we're talking about high hop loads. So reduced wort and beer losses is obvious. If we're using a lot of hop material, whether it's cone hop or T90 hops, we have a lot of cellulose that we need to remove, and that hop material is going to soak up wort and beer like a sponge. So the beer losses in some of these beers that are 4, 5, 6 pounds a barrel dry hop rate can be very high, where total beer losses may be 30 to 35%. I think that's probably less typical today than it was a few years ago, but whatever the losses are, they're going to be higher with a T90 or a cone hop if you're dry hopping or using a lot in the whirlpool or kettle. Accompanying that high wort and beer loss is going to be effluent. So if you're losing wort and beer, you're probably putting that stuff down the drain. So those liquid losses, whether it's wort or beer, represent BOD, which can be expensive. Biological oxygen demand is often used to evaluate the cost of effluent. And then also, you're probably going to have a pretty suspended solid load if your whirlpool bottoms and tank bottoms are going to be going down the drain, which for a lot of small brewers, that is the case. So those hop solids, from your whirlpool or your fermenter, if those go down the drain, that's part of your suspended solid load, and those effluent streams can be expensive, and that really is something that's pretty easy to reduce by using either a product like a T45 or with some fairly simple systems in the brewery to at least catch the suspended solids. And then finally, we have reduced whirlpool bottoms, which kind of falls along those points that I mentioned before. But the issue with whirlpool bottoms is that they usually have to be rinsed out with water. So anything we can do to reduce the whirlpool bottom, meaning like the size of the true pile, anything we can do to make that true pile smaller and easier to move out of the whirlpool is probably going to reduce the amount of rinse water that's required in the brewery. So those are kind of the arguments in favor of T45. Like I said before, I can't really think of any real disadvantages of this preparation. Now, one thing that you might be wondering, as far as the beer math goes, it doesn't matter. It's the same. It's going to be the same mass. Here's an example of a brew. We have a 20 hectoliter wort volume. That's our that's our produced wort volume that we're calculating for, with a target IBU of 30. 50% of the total IBUs are coming from the first hop edition. If the alpha acid content of the hop product is 8% and utilization is 35%, what's the weight of the first edition? So I'm just showing here some easy math because with hectoliters and IBUs and percentages, we don't have to use any decimals. So if we plug this into this equation, we can go 20 times 30 times 0.5. So that's 20 hectoliters, 30 IBU, 50% of the 30 IBU from that first edition. And we're dividing by 8, which is our alpha, and 35 is our utilization. And we calculate that we need 1.07 kilos of 8% alpha hops for this to be true. Now, if we go over and look at T45, it's the same math. The only thing that's different here is that I've changed the alpha in this example to be 16.9. I'm assuming the same utilization. In practice, you might get a little bit higher utilization out of T45 in comparison to T90, because some of that hot material can and does bind some of the isoalpha acid that's formed in the kettle. But just assuming the same utilization, you can see the math is the same. So if you're buying these pellets, there's nothing you need to know other than the alpha that's in the pellet. Now, another thing about beer math that's kind of cool, we can look at the raw hop alpha and use that as an indicator. So we have to estimate the raw hop alpha, unless you know that from your vendor, because you have to know what the alpha was before processing. But if we assume that the hops come in with about 5% moisture, we can and we retain the solids, we can estimate that hop alpha is 7.6% based upon a T95. So that's 8% alpha in the pellet times 0.95. And then we can compare our pellet alpha and the T45 example that I'm using at 16.9% divided by 7.6% leaf alpha. And we've got that enrichment factor of 2.2. And we can invert that and calculate our type. So this calcs out to be a type 45. So that just shows how those numbers are derived. Okay, we're going to do something I think kind of fun here. I do a lot of videos in my kitchen, so let me see if I can figure out how to get my phone turned on here. Of course, this worked in our practice session here. Let's see if I can. I think I'm having some technical difficulty. There we go. So I've got a couple, I'm going to stop my screen share here on my presentation. Got a couple things to show and tell here. One, now I'm assuming that there's some people in the audience that have never been to hop selection and maybe don't do a whole lot of evaluation of hops. But I don't care what kind of hops you're using, whether you're using cones or pellets type 90 or pellets type 45. It's good to get your hands dirty and rub and smell, but I'm kind of fussy when it comes to hop stuff on my hands. So I kind of like something to grind up the hops. And I really found something that works pretty awesome. This is a nut grinder. I will not be using this for my ice cream, but this is about 17 bucks. I bought this on Amazon, and this thing works like a champ. So first of all, what I want to show, and just kind of making an argument here, if we look at, this is, I'm calling this Type 100 Triumph. So these are compressed cones, and you can smell them, but it's not very difficult. It's not very easy to smell these cone hops. So if you grind up the hops into a kind of a grist, kind of looks like oregano, it's a whole lot easier to not only smell if you don't want to get your hands dirty, but if you do want to get your hands dirty, the hops are already kind of broken up and you can do a rub. Okay, so we know hop rubs. Really what I want to show here, besides making a mess, is that with the cone, you can take one of these bale cuts and look at a cross section of hops. So I'm going to put this up. I don't know if you can see that or not, but if you're able to ever get cross sections of compressed cones, you can see in that cross section. It's difficult to see, but you can see through the cross section of the hop. There's yellow goodness in there. That's the liquid gold that we want in our beer, pseudo liquid. That's the lupulin gland. There's all this messy stuff that ends up from a cone hop. So that's the raw material. And our T90, this is what a T90 looks like. Looks like hop pellets. Now, if you use my hop grinder, you can grind that up into a powder that's nice and easy to evaluate. So I've got two different T90s here just to show that in general, T90s look like hop pellets. So let's pull out some T whatevers. So this is a Citra, and I've calculated that this is a T51 Citra product, and it doesn't look a whole lot different than the T90. Now, the difference between a T, in this case, about a T51, is that when you go and smell the grist, and I'm gonna pull out some others. This is so just as a point of reference, this is a 12.8% alpha. Here's Mandarina Bavaria. This is a T45. So you can see that the appearance of this is, I don't know if you can see it clearly, but this is a little bit darker green. This is pretty high alpha. This is 18.9%. Oh, wow. And again, just smelling the grist that I made using my nut grinder, it's a pretty intense aroma. So the difference between the T45 or the T51, whatever, and the T90 is that we have a lot less plant material, and those aromas that come from the lupulin gland are amplified because these hops have a higher concentration of those products. So here's a Callista. This is a German aroma hop. This is a T43. And again, these are all fairly high intensity aromas. So what's the point here? Y'all are at home, you can't smell what I'm smelling. My point is that hop evaluation, whether you're evaluating a cone hop, like you would if you came out to selection in Yakima and you met with any hop vendor, BSG or anybody else out there, what you're going to be given during hop selection are bale cuts. And here's an example of a bale cut, what it might look like. So you would be given a bale cut to evaluate. So what you're going to be doing is grinding this up, usually with your hands, and you're going to use your sense of sight and smell to make judgments about the hops that you might want to select for brewing. Now, just because you select a hop or just because harvest is over, doesn't mean that when you bring in, let's say, here's one of our hop blends. This is sativa. So this is a T90. This is 9.4% alpha. And this has, to my nose, some spicy character to it, fair amount of stone fruit, peach pit, and some nice lemony orange notes to it. But when you're bringing hops into your brewery, you should also evaluate your hops before you brew. So I'm a big advocate of always checking out your hops before brewing. So I'm going to go back to my presentation and turn off my overhead camera here. And I'm going to wrap up real quick with one more slide. So in conclusion, question is, are you interested in T45s? BSG has T45s. If you are, reach out to your sales rep, find out what we have that we are offering from Germany, which is, we've carried T45s for a few years from Germany. But this year, this is kind of like an inside info for those attending. We will be releasing select US varieties in the very near future in the T45 format. So that's pretty cool and exciting. And again, I'm going to say this, I'm going to repeat myself. I think it's really, really important to evaluate hops, not only from a sensory aspect, whether you rub them or grind them or whatever you're going to do to smell what the hop is, but also to pilot the hop in beer. Because a lot of the aromas that we smell in hops are going to be blown out of the kettle when we boil wort. And then we also have the ability of biotransformation in the fermenter. So whether we're driving volatiles off during kettle boiling and or fermentation, or biotransforming hop compounds into things that are not present in the raw hop, we're not going to know what the finished beer tastes like unless we do a brewing trial. So one last shameless plug here. If you don't have a pilot brewery, check out our Grainfather products. We've got the Grainfather 40, that's a 40-liter all-in-one brewing system, and relatively new to the market is the Grainfather 70, which is a 70-liter or half barrel is the way I like to call it. It's a half-liter or half-barrel all-in-one brewing system, which is just perfect for doing trial brews. But that's basically what I have today. I want to thank y'all for attending Humulus U and joining in my kitchen, which is my little safe space here to play at home. And without chatting any further, I want to open the floor to questions that might be out there.
Thanks, Ashton. I'll come back in and I'll help manage some of these. So
thank you, Wayne.
Yeah, you bet. Looks like we got a couple of questions that came in through the Q&A. Like we said in the chat, and like I said at the beginning, feel free to keep sending those through. We'll answer them live right now, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. So Ashton, let's start with the first one on here about enrichment factor and sensory. And I think we talked about this a little bit, but just how does the enrichment factor affect sensory? Is more better?
That's a great question. Is more better? I think the way to look at it is that if you're currently happy with a hop that you're using, let's just not even name a variety. Let's just say you're using variety X and you're hopping at, let's say, 3 pounds per barrel. So you're a little bit on the high side. You really like the aroma of the hop in your beer. You like the hop flavor. But let's say that there's a flavor you don't like. And what you don't like is maybe that grassy, astringent character that comes with 3 pounds per barrel of hops. Now, if you switch to T45, and let's just assume the enrichment factor is 2, so you go from 3 pounds per barrel to 1.5 pounds per barrel, you're going to really dial down the knob on that astringent grassiness that comes from the plant matter. Now, there is an assumption here, and the assumption is that the enrichment factor, let's just assume it's 2, that it enriches equally between alpha and oil. And that's not always true. There can be oil loss in process, but it's generally true that you're going to have a fairly equal enrichment of alpha and oil because you're really enriching the lupulin gland content. Now, I'm going to take that question and flip it a different direction. Let's say you're making a beer that has a character that's supposed to be a little astringent. And I think that some of the continental pilsners that I'm really fond of, I think they do have well, I don't think, I know, they have an astringent character from the hops that's part of the character of that beer. So there are some styles where if you took traditional hops, whether it's cone or T90, and again, let's be extreme, let's say we switched it completely to extract that was devoid of plant matter, we could end up with a beer that's lacking astringency because we've removed it. So I think with any, like just anything else in brewing, it's a little bit of experimentation. You might even want to augment like a T45 hopped beer with another hop product. Let's say you brought in an aromatic extract, a hop oil extract, and you kind of tweaked it a little bit on the back end with a hop oil, because your T45 has alpha in it. And with anything that has alpha, you're going to have oxidized alpha, which is just part of hop. That's just part of the nature of hops. And some of those oxidized alpha compounds are bitter. So even though when you're dry hopping with T45 or T90, you can pick up bitterness, even though there's no isoalpha acid present.
Awesome. A couple more questions flowing in. Let's move on to the next one. So we know pellet density is important with dry hopping for proper distribution or breakup of the pellet in beer. How does the high density of alpha in a T45 influence that performance?
That's a great question. The density of the pellet. So let's do a little show and tell here. I'm gonna do a show and tell without any instruments. So I've got two pellets. This is a T90, and here's a pellet, and this is a T51. So this pellet's 9.3% alpha. This pellet is 12.8% alpha. So this has a higher density of alpha than this one does. But this pellet is a higher density pellet than this one. This pellet here, I just crushed it into a powder. This pellet is not only harder, but I know this is a higher density pellet because I know where they were produced. So the pellet density is different than the density of the alpha. Now, I think what you're really asking though is when you go to dry hop, it's ideal when you drop a pellet into beer, you don't want it to float and you don't want it to sink, because if it sinks, it'll shoot to the bottom of the tank and just kind of sit there and it doesn't give up its goodies to the beer. If it floats, it can literally form like a cap on the top of the beer, and it does the same thing. It doesn't release the aromatics in the beer. So you kind of want the pellet to kind of sink down a little bit, and we'd like to have the pellet be neutrally buoyant, where it just kind of floats in the beer column. And while it's kind of doing this, floating in the beer, it just kind of dissolves and breaks apart. So the easiest way to determine if that's going to occur is literally take a glass of water or beer and just drop a pellet in it and see what happens. Now, the other part of that is that when hops are pelletized, you can control pellet density. So pellet density is definitely something that hop processors look at and try to control the density to optimize the performance in the beer.
Yeah, as it comes to talking about density, anytime we talk about density of hop pellets, I always go back to that video that exists on our YouTube channel, I know, and I think we did a more modern version of it too, but it's exactly what you're talking to, Ashton. It's a video representation of all the different types of density pellets and what happens when you have too high of a density pellet, too low of a density pellet, and some talks about the BSG pellet, which is made to be kind of that middle ground. And it's a really, really fascinating video to watch and really see what happens. So I'll put a little plug out for that video if you want to check it out on our YouTube page.
Yeah, that's a cool video. Just dating myself a little bit, when I was a young brewer, Sierra Nevada was still a relatively small brewery, but I went to Davis and we'd have meetings where Sierra would come down and they'd always bring beer down from Chico. But one of the things they talked about that which just really blew my mind, back in the day when they still dry hop the same way in some of their beers, but they literally sew their dry hops up in these giant tea bags and drop them in the tanks when they pull them up, the tanks from the bottom, just crazy stuff. But they talked about pulling dry hop bags out of tanks and been full of beer for a week or two and still having dry spots in the hops. So it's really amazing how if you have like a pellet that's too dense, or if it's got like surface hardening from, let's say, a high pellet die temperature, the pellet literally can just hang out in the beer and just sit there and be fat and happy and do nothing.
Yeah, not the best experience for sure.
No.
I think I will put one more call out there for Q&A if there's any other questions coming through. otherwise, Ashton, any other things that you want to comment on that have come to you since doing the Q&A?
Well, I guess I have kind of maybe a question for myself. So how does T45 differ from other products that are in the market that are also concentrated? Well, if you go out and look at different products, there's a pretty wide range of products these days that have different names. You call them fanciful names, but the methods that are used to make enriched pellets are pretty much the same across the board. So the T45 technology is just a little bit younger than I am, been out there for a long time. And it's really kind of interesting to look back and say, well, what happened with T45? Because my first brewing job was Sudork Brewery in Davis back in 1992. We used T45s then, but they weren't common. You know, they just weren't that common. And the reason they weren't common is that they were only made in Germany. Well, I shouldn't say only made, but they were principally made in Germany. So today, with all the great hoppy beers that the industry is producing, and just the love of the hop that craft brewers have, there's a lot of different products out on the market that kind of fall under this umbrella of T45. So this is kind of a generic presentation and applies to several products.
Very cool. I think that will do it, Ashton. So thanks again. Obviously appreciate the chat. Always a good topic to talk about. I will say to the group, if there's any further questions, feel free to reach out to us. You can reach out to us at info@bsgcraft.com, and we can make sure that routes its way. I will say Ashton did a great job of prepping for next week's webinar, which I'm really happy about, which is sensory tips and tricks for your hop sensory experience. That will be myself. I finally get to not just host one of these, but I do get to provide some additional commentary. And then Libby Stahl from the RAR Technical Center over here will be talking about hop sensory, doing some live hop sensory, and introducing some new tools that we've developed that we can share out with folks to make hop sensory easier for everybody. Again, like I said earlier, all of our past webinars along with future webinars can be found on our YouTube page, youtube.com/bsgcraft. Announcements of future webinars along with other great info can be found on our newsletter and social. So make sure that you're subscribed to our newsletter and following us at BSG Craft on all of our social medias. So from all of us here, thanks Ashton again, and thanks to everybody for showing up, and look forward to chatting more about hops soon. Thanks again, everybody.
Cheers.